Along with Debussy, he stands at the forefront of the so-called impressionists. He was also expelled from the same school twice. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Maurice Ravel. Ravel was born in a Basque town in the south of France in 1875. This Basque heritage influenced his music from the beginning to the end. He got piano lessons when he was 7 and formal compositional training at 12. Although never hailed as a child prodigy, it was soon discovered that he had a natural ear for music. These early pieces do not survive in full, but fragments have been preserved and subsequently recorded. These years were highly important for Ravel's musical development, as he assimilated everything from traditional Spanish music and dances to Wagner's operas to the orchestral works of Russia's Mighty Handful to Javanese gamelan, which highly affected Debussy as well, and had shifted the older composer's outlook to one of a more economical means. In 1889, Ravel applied to the Paris Conservatoire and got in based on his solid performances of the music of Frédéric Chopin. At the Conservatoire, his only true claim to fame was in the piano competitions, which he won 2 years after entering the institution. But he was not particularly well suited to the rigorous academic environment. He preferred learning at his own pace and in his own way. His musical thoughts and expressions were fast becoming much too modern for the extremely conservative faculty, and this would later erupt in a massive scandal, about which more later. The way the Conservatoire worked was that students went for particular prizes in subjects, and students who did not win prizes in these subjects for several years in a row were in serious danger of being expelled. He wanted to be a composer, but his style did not match any of what the faculty wanted, and so he was expelled in 1895, 4 years after his first and only prize. Ravel was a very good pianist, but he knew that he really didn't have the drive or the capacity to become one of the great pianist composers, so he instead focused all of his talent into composition. Several early pieces would end up being reworked and orchestrated into larger forms, as Ravel was never a particularly fast worker. These works are certainly good pieces, but up until this point, nothing that he had written truly bore the spark of genius. New inspiration was found in the eccentric figure of Erik Satie and his whimsical Dadaist musical innovations. Satie, who had long had a kind of frenemy relationship with Debussy, could now count Ravel amongst his few champions. 1897 saw Ravel back at the Conservatoire, and his compositional maturity would come under the tutelage of Gabriel Fauré. Fauré was by all accounts a very pleasant man who tried not to get into the inner workings of Conservatoire faculty politics, something which would end up behooving him later. And despite his compositional style, which was as conservative as the rest of them, he possessed an ear that was much more sympathetic to Ravel's newfound maturity. However, Fauré was the exception rather than the rule, and since the other faculty still didn't appreciate Ravel, he was again kept from winning any prizes and was expelled in 1900. Despite being treated extremely poorly by the Conservatoire for over a decade, Ravel would continue to audit Fauré's classes for 3 more years. Ravel's slow progress was the result of his stringent self-criticism. He would often write entire pieces in his head, working out the most minute of details before writing down the entire piece in one fell swoop. On the flip side, this meant that he really couldn't bring himself to care about what the critics said, either positively or negatively. This perfectionism also emerged in his impeccable wardrobe, something that was a defining aspect of his personality to his friends. Alma Mahler thought him a narcissist for his attention to style and fashion. At this point, Ravel was just starting to become known outside of his immediate circle, although he was still not really hailed as an important new voice or anything like that. Ravel joined up with his artistic friends in an informal group known as the Apaches, or more appropriately translated, the Hooligans. Hooligan meetings were regular through the first decade of the new century, and included the pianist Ricardo Viñas, a longtime friend of Ravel's who would later go on to premiere many of Ravel's great piano pieces, as well as occasionally featuring appearances by the young Igor Stravinsky. The Hooligans were similarly artistically minded and wanted to push back against stifling artistic conservatism that they felt was really hampering the development of French culture going forward. As such, they were vociferous in their support of the work of Claude Debussy. When Debussy's opera Pelléas et Mélisande was premiered, tellingly, students at the Conservatoire were banned by their faculty from attending the performances, whereas Ravel was on the front lines, or the front row, supporting what he saw as an important new step forward. As Ravel became more and more known for his music, specifically his piano music as played by Vignes, he became more and more closely associated in the minds of the French musical public as an impressionist alongside Debussy. Debussy, for his part, absolutely hated the term and didn't thought it applied whatsoever to his musical expression. And while Ravel was okay with the term as applied to his elder, he didn't think that it applied to him either. Ravel loved Debussy's music, but he recognized that his own personal style was in a more crafted and a more refined direction. Nevertheless, Ravel grappled with the influence of Debussy probably more than any other composer, and this imposing presence really pushed Ravel to develop his own style. Like Debussy, Ravel wrote a single string quartet, and while it is doubtless indebted to the older master, it is by itself a phenomenal piece. Ravel's quartet is notable in that it actually helped cause a scandal, about which more later. The two composers' personal friendship, never close, terminated in the mid-1900s, with critics taking sides. It didn't help that when Debussy abandoned his wife for his mistress, Ravel helped set up a stipend for the abandoned wife. Oh, and you thought that Ravel was done with the Conservatoire? Not so
fast.
They ran a yearly composers competition known as the Prix de Rome, where the prize was a trip to Rome. Throughout the early years of the new century, Ravel sought to add his name to the list of prestigious French composers who were past winners. He came in second place in 1901, but got nowhere in the next couple of years. He butted heads with the conservative faculty despite having specifically written cantatas in their style to appeal to them. Nothing, it seems, could be done to win these people over. 1905 was the last year that Ravel was eligible, and he got promptly eliminated in the very first round. Public outcry at this early dismissal began in earnest, because he had recently just finished his masterful string quartet, and he was now known amongst the French musical public as one of the premier young composers. When it was revealed that only the students of a particular senior member of the Conservatoire's composition faculty had advanced, the press went bananas. It was known as the Ravel Affair. The government actually had to step in and completely reformulate the way the Conservatoire worked. Fauré was tapped to be the Conservatoire's new leader. Fauré also became the president of the Société Musicale Indépendante, which was effectively run by Ravel and several of Fauré's former pupils. This was in response to the conservatism of the Société Nationale de Musique, headed up by the reactionary Vincent Dandy. The Indépendante was all about heavy promotion of the kinds of pieces that Dandy and his ilk wouldn't touch with a 10-foot baton. This led to more performances of Ravel's pieces, and also occasionally enlisted his services as a performer in his pieces and the pieces of others. 1909 saw the commission of what is, in many eyes, Ravel's premier orchestral masterpiece, the ballet Daphnis et Chloé, for the impresario Sergei Diaghilev. While the piece is now rightfully known as a masterpiece of orchestration, practically a whole orchestration textbook unto itself, its production left Ravel so shocked that he was unable to compose for the next couple of months. As for Diaghilev, he would end up becoming best known for his role in commissioning Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which Ravel attended the premiere of and immediately grasped that piece's historical significance. Ravel's piano music really epitomized what made his style his own. Aside from a few pieces that kind of blur the distinction, Ravel's piano music is almost the antithesis of what Debussy's is. His suites Mirar and Gaspard de la Nuit rank among the masterpieces in the 20th century piano literature. The final movement of Gaspard de la Nuit is entitled Scarbo, and was intended by Ravel to be the most difficult piano piece ever written. And while debate as to what the most difficult piece is still rages on, Scarbo still has a pretty good shot at the title. When World War I broke out, Ravel attempted to enlist in the Air Force, but was declined due to his short stature and small heart defect. He was undeterred and attempted enlistment several more times before the ambulance corps finally let him in, at the age of 40. As the driver, he was put in as much danger as many of the troops. He would often travel along streets of towns that were being shelled, and went through more than his fair share of near-death experiences. He himself was hospitalized for dysentery. Enduring the horrors of war might have led many in his position to become staunchly anti-German in artistic outlook. But when he became aware of a proposed ban on all German music being performed in France, he wrote eloquently against it. As a result, the reactionaries that were proposing the ban also banned his music, but it's the thought that counts. As Ravel recuperated from his various war experiences, his mother passed away after a long battle with illness. Afterwards, Ravel became a somber and melancholy man. His musical output, never fast, now dwindled to an average of one piece a year. During the war, he had written the surprisingly jovial Le Tombeau de Couperin, a neo-Baroque suite where each movement is dedicated to the memory of a friend who had fallen during the war. Despite the reduced output, the death of Debussy during the war years meant that Ravel was now the premier French composer of international reputation. In a twist of irony, the iconoclastic Ravel was now seen as a figure of the musical establishment. The Satie followers, who were to become known as Les Six, not only lumped Debussy and Ravel together in one school, but actively thought that those two were working against the betterment of truly French music. They didn't consider Ravel or Debussy truly French in their artistic output. Ravel, ever neutral, really didn't care what Les Six did and was even friends with its female member, Germaine Taillefer. As recording technology began taking off in the 1920s, Ravel was also on the forefront of that, leading recording sessions of many of his pieces. The true shock of the post-war world was evident in La Valse, intended as a ballet score for Diaghilev. Diaghilev's objection meant that the piece ended up not as a ballet, but as primarily just a pure concert piece. La Valse represents the sheer decadence and unfurling social fabric surrounding the Great War, all seen through the lens of an abstractly shell-shocked musician. Further works show an appreciation of jazz, the culmination of his one meeting with George Gershwin, and jazzy elements would work their way into his later pieces, such as his piano concerto in G major. He played this to acclaim with orchestras around the world, and in 1928 actually toured for 4 months in the United States, where he was met with the biggest applause and biggest standing ovations of his entire career. Although he was touched by the fact that the Americans appreciated him seemingly more than the French did, he was still, as ever, completely unfazed by the critics, who now loved him. His affinity for jazz made for a great fit in his extant harmonic language, as he was fond of using extended chords as well as modes instead of major and minor keys. During the composition of the G major concerto, Ravel was approached by the one-handed pianist Paul Wittgenstein, and he asked Ravel to write a concerto for the left hand. This resulted in a work that's almost the complete opposite of the G major. Despite his slow working, Ravel was clearly able to compartmentalize musical thought and work on 2 completely disparate projects at the same time, even if they were for the exact same instrumentation. This same period resulted in a very unusual ballet score, Bolero. As Ravel himself said, this piece is a piece for orchestra without actual music. The idea behind Bolero is simple. Simply take a musical idea, well, technically 2 musical ideas, and then just keep repeating them and repeating them
and repeating them.
But each repeat, the orchestration becomes different and more complex. As a form, the piece is more than rubbish, but it's practically an orchestration textbook, and alongside Daphnis et Chloe, actually represents the pinnacle of Ravel's orchestral achievement. Bolero is also the culmination of Ravel's long-time interest in dance forms, from his early pavane for a dead princess, through minuets and habaneras, and really any dance he could get his hands on. In 1932, Ravel was involved in a car accident in which he injured his head. Ravel was already growing scattered and absent-minded, and this blow to the head made whatever condition this was really bad, really quickly. No one as of yet has ever been accurately able to diagnose exactly what caused his mental issues. But whatever it was, it quickly left him completely unable to compose. He could still hear music in his head, but he was unable to transfer it to either the keyboard or to manuscript paper, and attempts to relearn how to do this completely failed. After 4 years enduring a life that must have been torturous beyond imagination, he agreed to undergo an experimental neurosurgery. After the surgery, he went into a coma and died in December of 1937, age 62. Ravel was not known for giving composition lessons, and he pushed the few pupils he had into developing their own styles. He was highly conscious that imitation of past composers was an easy pitfall. Ralph vaughan Williams counted amongst his students, and vaughan Williams always credited Ravel with pushing him to develop his own specifically English style away from German bombast. Gershwin approached Ravel for lessons, but was declined after much thought. Since Ravel thought that lessons would only turn Gershwin into a second-rate Ravel, when he was already a first-rate Gershwin. As you might have gleaned from the rest of this video, Ravel is rightly known as one of the greatest orchestrators who ever lived. Not only did he rework many of his own pieces in orchestral garb, but he also wrote the most famous orchestral arrangement of Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. Now, this is a piece that was very popular to orchestrate, and dozens of other composers had tried their hand at it, but ever since Ravel published his orchestration, no other composer has gotten close. And if an orchestra is going to be playing Pictures at an Exhibition, you can pretty much be guaranteed that it's going to be Ravel. In fact, Ravel's orchestration actually is arguably more famous than Mussorgsky's piano original. From a formal perspective, Ravel was a classicist who wanted to breathe new life into old forms. As a French composer, writing for the voice was nigh inescapable, and his vocal writing shows an interest and absorption from everything from Debussyan staticism to sensual word painting. Ravel took great steps to shroud his personal life in extreme secrecy, and there is still very little we know about it. His students claim that he frequented brothels, but this has not stopped modern scholars from speculating that he was gay. I'm rather inclined to believe his students and contemporaries, but still, the point stands, we know very, very, very little about what he was actually like. But what he did say was that the only love affair he had ever had was with music.